The following program is an original production of WYCC PBS Chicago.
Good evening, I'm Chris Bury.
And I'm Barbara Pinto. Welcome to a special presentation of In the Loop, a closer look at food deserts and urban farming.
More than 300,000 Chicagoans live in food deserts, neighborhoods that lack fresh, healthy, and affordable food. But now more residents hope to cultivate their way to better options.
Tonight we take a journey with a woman who has to travel miles to find nutritious food, and we'll visit the newest crop of urban farmers sprouting up around Chicago.
I'll take 63rd Street bus down to the shuttle bus, the red line that is closed down, and I'll take the shuttle bus down to 87.
For 40-year-old Michelle Martin, a single mother, the simple act of grocery shopping isn't simple at all. Finding healthy, affordable food requires a half-hour trip from her Englewood home on Chicago's South Side.
You're going to save at least $1 to $2 per product at another store. So you have to travel. It's worth the travel.
Englewood is dotted with corner mini-marts that carry a limited selection of groceries, most of it junk food. There are a few, if any, fresh fruits and vegetables, and Michelle doesn't trust the quality at those stores.
Grocery stores, they use a lot of the dyes to dye the meat. You know, they put the meat under the light, got you thinking that you're purchasing something good and you get it home, and it's not. It might be green when you get it home.
As of 2011, more than 380,000 Chicagoans lived in so-called food deserts, like Michelle's neighborhood. According to food and health researcher Mari Gallagher, Chicago's food deserts are mainly concentrated on the city's west, south, and far south sides, predominantly African-American communities. Last fall, upscale grocer Whole Foods announced plans to build a grocery store on a vacant lot in the heart of Englewood, with the city pitching in $10 million. Mayor Rahm Emanuel praised the project as a way to bring jobs and healthy food to a neighborhood in need of both.
You have no idea how difficult it is for people throughout the city, in parts of our city, to just be in their neighborhood and get the same access that other people take for granted.
Michelle is skeptical about the Whole Foods store coming to her neighborhood.
Whatever you build, just give us quality and keep it quality. Don't start out quality to get our money and take it away and think that we're supposed to just purchase whatever you have there.
Beyond access to grocery stores, some urban residents in food deserts are taking over empty lots to grow their own fresh vegetables.
I would have to say this place means the world because we trying to help feed the world.
Meet 22-year-old Tyrus Walker, a new breed of farmer, growing acres of spinach, carrots, tomatoes, and berries in the shadow of manufacturing plants and interstate highways. The nonprofit Growing Power runs the Iron Street farm where he works, cultivating produce, training up a new batch of urban growers, and providing easier access to healthy foods in communities where fresh produce is hard to find.
So we teach them how to do composting, how to layer it. We teach them different experiments with the herbs that we grow.
Iron Street is just one of a growing number of urban farms taking root around Chicago. Farmed Here LLC opened this 90,000 square foot indoor farm in Bedford Park last year, the largest indoor farm in the country.
In 2050, 70% of world population will live in urban areas. So I'm like, we need something local, we need something fresh, we need something good.
Whether indoors or out, the mission of these urban farms is the same.
I think we need to have urban farms because food is a human right. Because people need to be able to know where their food comes from, have control and sovereignty over it, and be active participants in their own destiny.
Erica Allen is the Chicago and National Projects Director for Growing Power. Her father, Will Allen, started the organization over 20 years ago in Milwaukee. Now there are 15 urban farmer training centers nationwide.
We eat 3 times a day. So the fact that we have no investment in our food growing infrastructure, that is this sustainable? Well, it sure better be. People need to have food that's locally grown. We can't rely on California all the time.
Growing Power sells fresh produce to several area restaurants, to Walgreens, and other stores, including the Green Grocer on Grand Avenue.
You know that when we put in an order, it's going to be picked that day. So rather than having something shipped in and being on a truck or a train from Mexico and not having any idea of who's behind it or how long it's been there, I don't think it's just a fad, something that provides jobs and provides training in a real concrete way.
We are joined by three guests with in-depth knowledge of food deserts and urban farming. Dr. Pancho McFarland, Associate Professor of Sociology at Chicago State University. Mari Gallagher, Food and Health Researcher of Mari Gallagher Research and Consulting Group. And Zed McLaurin, founder of McLaurin Development Partners. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Hello.
Mari, we'll start with you. You authored the study that basically brought the term food deserts into the national conversation. Can you just explain to us what is a food desert and do they only exist in impoverished neighborhoods?
Right, and that was back in 2006. There's been a lot happening since then. We define food deserts as large geographic areas that cluster, that have no or only distant, what we call mainstream food options. And they're not just in impoverished areas. In fact, in Chicago, we have over 12,000 households that are in the food desert still today. But we see them all across the country in many different kinds of communities. I'm working on a project now in rural Iowa, and we have some challenges there with healthy food. So it's not just in poor areas. We got to be careful about those stereotypes.
Is one of the issues, as we saw in the setup piece, just transportation, that people can't get to these places, Ed?
Sure. Infrastructure, as was mentioned in the piece, is a critical component of it. Accessibility and the economic component of it as well. The piece talked about a single mom that travels great distances to get access to healthy food. That's a critical component of her day, which could be used elsewhere.
Yeah, we see
Right.
Dominic's closing.
Right,
So
right.
supermarkets being taken out of the pipeline. Some of those are being maintained by Mariano's and some other places. But I'm wondering, we talked about the neighborhoods where this exists. What about the broader impact of food deserts? It's not just a matter of what you shop and what you can eat.
Right, in terms of just on health. And,
Yeah.
Right, so, and I'll say too, we don't have one single problem, one single solution. So, transportation is an issue, cost sometimes, we have a lot of different challenges, but it really does it can have a devastating impact on families. We found in pretty much every study, and we're not saying access is the silver bullet, just plop down a grocery store. In fact, we're saying there's a wide range of solutions that we want to embrace, but you can't choose healthy food unless you have access to it. And we find in Chicago, not having access means statistical significance to more premature death by diabetes and also greater incidence of both overweight and obesity. So it's a problem.
Dr. McFarland, is it getting any better? We've seen so much attention. Michelle Obama's campaign, we've seen Walgreens now selling produce. Are some of these organizations really starting to make a difference?
Oh, I think certainly at the familial level and, in certain areas, absolutely. I know the work that we do impacts families and their food budget, their health. On a wider scale, I'm not so sure, and it's not because of the work we do isn't important, but because of just the economy and the breakdown in the economy and the employment crisis. And, in a bigger sense, all the food options that we have, it seems like the food is getting worse that is coming from the industrial capitalist agribusiness sector. So it's having an impact, but at the same time, there are more people starving, more people having less access, et cetera.
When you go ahead.
That's
Zed.
a critical component of it. We found that in some of the work we've done, that the re-education of local communities is a critical part of healthy food access. They've been so accustomed to buying packaged processed goods off the shelf for so many years. So families find themselves now at this divide of having to learn a new way to provide food culture to themselves and their families.
So the food culture needs to change then.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And what are you needing to teach people who have existed one way for so
Right.
long?
Well, I would even just say one thing about changing the culture is having that access too, right? Having it on lots of different levels. So not just a big supermarket, but also the urban gardening, community gardening, talking about it in schools, talking about it in churches, embracing that healthier food choice. It's hard to do when in your neighborhood you can't find those choices. But I think education is one of many key components, certainly, and then cost too. And also even just simple things like going in and trying this particular kinds of healthy food that you maybe never had before, like kale or certain kinds of fresh greens.
So there's education around food choices, for example. One of the things that we do, I work with a community group called the Green Lots Project, and education is central to us because it's not, access is one thing, you might have food there, but if you don't know that you need that or that's important to you, then you're not going to make that choice. So it's almost a false choice if you don't have the education. But there's other aspects of the food question that education can help with. So I talk about food justice, right? And what are some of the components of food justice? Well, it's having food, obviously, the access question, but it's also having decision-making power over your food. And you need to have some education in order to do that. What is good for me? How do I cook these things? One of the things that we try to do in our organization is we try to educate people on the traditions, their ethnic and cultural traditions that we've sort of lost as we've migrated to the cities and we become dependent on the agribusiness system or the government for our food. And so we do a lot of stuff around teaching the history of our foodstuffs and our traditions, our food arts and sciences, sometimes we call it. So one of the things that we like to do is talk about the history of African and African American growing traditions and preparation traditions, as well as Mesoamerican ones for our Mexican population.
What if that's not available? You can have all the education you want, but if you can't get that stuff?
Well, the education is part of it, is to grow it. Why is it important to grow it? And then we talk about the money part too. It saves us a lot of money. So right, you may not have access to it. You may not have access to those traditional foods, and all you have access is to the packaged foods that they showed in the video. And part of what we're trying to do is get people to understand that this is part of your tradition, and this is part of something you should be proud of over a long history of some of the things we talk about in our communities and Black and Latino communities is sort of our victimization, right? And one of the things I like to talk about is, look, we're very powerful. Look what you did. You have this whole tradition, thousands of years in many cases, of growing food and developing food. You should be proud of that, embrace that, and I'll teach you how to do it, or we'll teach you as an organization how to do that.
And of course, health is very important in this. And communities with limited access to grocery stores have higher rates of chronic disease. The documentary Colorblind, Rethinking Race explores how the lack of choices impacts this population.
Food is medicine. Bottom line is, what's so profound for me is that diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer prevention are rooted in intervention and healing happening in the body.
You go, girl.
Food can actually prevent and intervene in all three of these illnesses. And if we make eating healthy something that the family shares, friends shares, something that a community shares, then we begin to transform.
But eating healthy isn't just a matter of personal choice. The ability to get healthy food is also dependent on access and affordability.
There are communities that can afford to have a Whole Foods or another kind of supermarket, and another community has to have a Super Value or a Save-A-Lot or shop at a drugstore in order to get their groceries. That food system is fragile.
And Zeb, Chicago is trying to change this. We saw that Whole Foods is coming to Englewood. What kind of an impact do you think that sort of decision is going to have?
Let's put aside the economics of Whole Foods viability at that location. I think it opens up the arena for those residents, particularly in that neighborhood, to say we are deserving of this choice, and this choice then is available to us to impact our lives. We mentioned earlier about the health impact of the food access, and the piece previously about the young lady that has to package goods as her sole source of food. So it at least provides options and choice for the consumer, which is a major step in the right direction.
But can they afford it? That's the big question, Marty.
Can they afford it? Well, again, we have to be careful about falling into the stereotype that everyone who has challenges is poor. In terms of the new Whole Foods, they do have a number of items that are much more affordable. I really like the idea of lots of different choices for community so that they can maybe get some of their produce at your garden and shop it also at the grocery store, and kind of keep everybody on their competitive toes to step up and provide the best, the healthiest product available at good prices. And certainly there are people who are very sensitive. They're very cost sensitive. But many of these items don't have to be that expensive. Some of the items that you're talking about, I know before the show he was sharing that he eats a lot during the summer from his own garden, almost exclusively, like 90-95% of his. So there are many things that we all can do. They don't always have to be expensive.
That competition is very good because just survey the landscape, you notice multiple drugstores located in the same area competing against one another. The consumer wins at the end of the day in that regard.
Absolutely. It's good for the market. It's good for public health. And in the clip that we saw earlier, you see a lot of these fringe stores attracting more fringe stores. When you have a higher option come in, whether it's really a very nice community garden or a Whole Foods or another good grocer, it sends a different signal to the marketplace. It says, hey, everybody, let's all step up.
Right.
We can, we should. But unfortunately, retail attracts retail, and in many of these underserved neighborhoods, they have more of the same, I'm not against liquor stores, but these food liquor stores or these packaged goods stores, they tend to cluster. So this is something that Whole Foods and other projects will address, and one of your projects right now that you're working on, not too far away.
Right, it's an anchor that we think will spur other economic development, and similarly with other projects we've developed on the south side and west sides.
Well, you talk about. Oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I just want to say something slightly different from the other two guests. One of the concerns that many of us have regarding something like a Whole Foods coming to Inglewood is this question of historical gentrification. And so, is the Whole Foods in Inglewood for the current residents, or is it for a new crop of residents that might be coming in? And this is a big concern of ours when we talk about grocery stores coming in, and so one of the solutions is we'll bring a grocery store here and that'll serve all these people and it'll help with the food desert problem. But with something like Whole Foods, it's when we have these big high-end things, they're sort of the pilgrims into sort of colonizing the land, and so into bringing a new group of people. And so a lot of residents that I've talked to, a lot of my students at Chicago State, are very concerned about that as a possibility. That yes, they're bringing some nice food. One, we can't afford it. Two, is that going to start raising the taxes on our homes? Are we going to be able to live here? What else is going to happen to our community? So that's just another
That's
angle
another
on
point of view.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about viability too, and wanting different choices. From Zeb, from your perspective, how do you convince another supermarket chain or other bigger operations that developing something in an impoverished neighborhood is profitable?
Well, certainly Whole Foods was incented to locate in that Inglewood, at that area. But we believe, though, that there's a larger economic picture that's at play. I'm famous for making the statements that Whole Foods is not really in the business of selling fresh produce, nor is Home Depot in the business of selling widgets and hammers and nails. They're primarily in the real estate business, which has a dramatic impact on their bottom line. And so they are investing millions of dollars into the real estate, whether they own it or not. It's encumbered for many decades into the future. So they're making an economic decision first and foremost. Is this good real estate for us to invest in? Because that store will have a capital base of $20, $30, $40 million. At the end of the day, will we get a viable return on that dollar? In the Whole Foods case and at Inglewood, we believe, it's going to have a different price structure and model. So therefore, the profit incentive may not be a real driving factor for their location. And it's really about bringing a component of a health-conscious environment and part of the re-education of the entire city.
But as you say, they are getting an incentive in the form of taxpayer money. And should taxpayers be subsidizing a company like Whole Foods, even if it is coming to Inglewood?
Right, and just to add, I mean, I've been doing different kinds of projects around the city for many, many years. I've been around a long time, but lots of grocery store projects get incentives. And I would just say what we're a fan of is using good data and information to identify what kind of incentive, how much, and really measure that through a public health return. But I don't think that particular Whole Foods is, super over incented for that project.
Right.
There are so many different TIF projects and all kinds of projects. There are a lot of different forms of city incentives that have been going on for decades and that are going on now. But I do think it's always an opportunity to ask each time, what's the public health return? What's the economic development return? How do we include, how are we helping people who already live in the neighborhood? Those kind of questions. There are clear ways that you can measure that objectively, and that's how projects should be incented.
I think the incentive component of this is a pretty interesting conversation. The city went for the Tony Award here and going after probably the most sought after grocer in the marketplace. And that, I think they look at it as a more global perspective. We are incenting everything that might come as a result of Whole Foods locating at this site. And so the ongoing viable retail development that will occur, the job creation, obviously, and additional economic development.
Are they rolling the dice, though, the city, with this kind of investment?
I don't know if they're rolling the dice. I think that the guys are probably pretty smart about how much money they're going to make on the end. The question becomes how is it going to affect the citizens who need that food and need those resources. How does it impact larger issues of food justice, self-determination? Do we get to decide what kinds of food goes in? What issues in food? Whole Foods has a problem with their workers and with where they source their food. So this is another food justice issue. how are the workers who are picking our food and it's going to Whole Foods, how are they paid? What are their lifestyles like? So it's broader than just the issue of access. There's a number of issues. What kinds of techniques are used? What kinds of energy is used to drive this? So there's environmental issues, there's labor issues, there's health issues, there's a lot of other things happening. And one of the major things is that I'm concerned is self-determination. Do we get an opportunity to determine what goes into our bodies and how those things are produced?
All right, we'll take a moment to shift gears to urban farming. Angela Mason, Director of Community Gardening at Chicago Botanic Garden, gives some insight on things to consider when you grow food in the city. Let's hear what she has to say.
The thing that people have to be aware of is you don't just take this piece of land that you have access to and start digging in the ground. You first have to test your soil. And the soil in the city has contaminants. A lot of the city land has different heavy metals like lead and mercury present in the soil. And the last thing that you want to do is start growing healthy vegetables to eat and then eat vegetables that are then taking up those heavy metals. You're defeating the purpose of eating healthy if you're eating vegetables that have taken up those heavy metals.
Dr. McFarland, the idea of producing organic food in the concrete jungle does seem a bit counterintuitive. What do you need to consider besides the soil quality when you're setting up an urban garden?
She's right on in the piece. I mean, the one thing that we talk about as gardeners is the quality of the soil conservation, and building up your soil, because everything starts from that. So we know that there's all kinds of toxins in our soil right now. And so when we have started gardens in the past, the thing that I was told when I started getting into this several years ago was, here in the city we just build up the soil. We don't dig in. We don't plant into the soil that's already there because we're almost certain it's going to be full of lead or full of other kinds of toxins. The suggestion is you test it for various things, and if it's okay, you go ahead. But in lieu of that, we just bring in good, nice soil and start building up from that. So that's the first thing is the soil. Mm-hmm.
One of the questions that's being raised is urban farming profitable? Because most of these places are either nonprofits or they're getting some kind of subsidy. Mara?
I would guess that might not be your starter question. Like if you're at the community level, how can you make it sustainable? There are efforts that are for profit. There are many efforts that are nonprofit. I think that urban gardening, urban agriculture has a number of important goals. Certainly producing clean, healthy food is one. Getting the community involved, doing the education piece. So I think you really have to evaluate that question based on the broader objectives. But we see many viable urban gardening projects in Chicago and other places around the country. So we're very encouraged by that, and we think that it adds a new dimension to all of these questions that we're talking about regarding education, food, health, community, democracy, participation, and quite frankly, some have trouble with scale, but some aren't trying to feed the whole city either. They're trying to get people involved in their neighborhood. You had a clip earlier from Farmed Here. That's a different kind of venture. So, and they're certainly reaching scale with what they're doing.
I'd like to answer it a different way, and there are a few needles in the haystack, if you will, regarding the soil issue especially. We're developing a project now on the far south side, north end of the Pullman community, with a major not-for-profit, Trinity United Church of Christ. But they've been able to locate and identify some land that is virgin land here in the city of Chicago, in the Oasis, which is unheard of, so it's never been developed. So our initial soil reports have come back very clean. But more importantly, I think they're looking at options to have raised beds and other hydroponic components to the program. And the question of profitability, I think they are looking at it not only from an economic viable standpoint, but also from a human viability standpoint. Their initial investment here, the profit will be in workforce development, the profit will be in sustainable lifestyles and the re-education of persons who will eat this food. One of the things I've learned in working with them on this project is their goal is to simultaneously have drug prescriptions from a doctor, but fitness and food prescriptions as well that will round out the well-being of the persons in the community.
It's an interesting perspective. When you talk about combating food deserts on the whole and urban gardening as a solution, how much, or even urban farming, I'm sorry, as a solution, how much can you grow in these urban spaces?
You'd be surprised. You can grow a lot of food if you do it right. There's all kinds of growing techniques that we've learned. And one of the, speaking back to the education thing, all these nice organic kinds of sustainable growing practices, these come from Africa, and they come from Mexico and all these places where our ancestors were really developing these ideas of how to grow properly, how to grow ecologically, how to grow with nature as opposed to against it. And if you do it right, you can grow a lot of food. We grow hundreds of pounds every year in our one garden that is 2 city lots. Hundreds of pounds, and we have more food than we can give away. So you can grow a lot of food.
One Harvard economist has sort of famously said this is a really poor use of land, that cities are really dense places for population, and when you start putting farms in cities, it's just not economical.
I think that is a statement from the Ivory Tower, and I do love the Ivory Tower as well. But when you look at Chicago, if we want to just map all the vacant, underutilized lots.
We have the land.
We have a lot of land, and there's a city program right now, which I think is a good one, that's looking at locally based neighborhood revitalization, building off of these vacant lots. Some of them will be used for gardens, some might be used for something else. But remember, like uses attract more of the same, and blighted vacant lots, many of them do have pretty decent soil. I'm with you on raising the bed, but I think that we have to look at what we actually have block by block across the city, and unfortunately, we have a lot of clustering of these vacant and underutilized lots in particular kinds of areas, primarily on the west, south, and far south side. So I think we need to figure out how to use them as economic development drivers, and then when there's more activity and it reaches that balance, then maybe those lots go back to another use or something. But I think it's an opportunity. And I think we want to see some diversity in the city. We don't want to just maximize density everywhere. We want to have different scales, and we want to be able to embrace some of these other activities and values in the city, as well as just maximizing real estate.
Yeah. At the risk of go ahead.
Master planning and land use entitlements is obviously a critical component to it, but as Mari mentioned, when you look at the decades of disinvestment in many of these communities and there haven't been viable options, what's wrong with urban agriculture then as a temporary or permanent solution to some of these areas?
Mari Gallagher, last word.
I think that this is a good conversation, and I think what we're seeing more of is many conversations with many different voices, and that will help public health, it'll help the market, it will help encourage local communities across the city and across our nation step forward and contribute to better food and better health. And that's what we all need to do in all of our families.
A few seconds left.
I just want to encourage people to come out and get their hands in the soil, because it has more, it's not just about what you put in your body, it's about the spiritual, the mental, the emotional things that we can do in the garden. So there's a lot of connections.
I have gardening nails, I told you.
Yeah.
I do it too.
So we all need to work on our green thumbs.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
That wraps up this special presentation of In the Loop, giving us an in-depth look at food deserts and urban farming. We'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Pancho McFarland, Mari Gallagher, and Zed McLaurin. I'm Chris Bury.
And I'm Barbara Pinto. Until next week, good night.
Goodbye.